Hello, everyone. My name is Devadas, and I'm the CEO of the Future Moves Group. Welcome to part 4 of a 7-part series on Singapore and economic crisis. Today, we're going to be talking about a very important subject, which is accountability. Now, when we talk about accountability, we're going to be speaking within the context of using measurable data of the economic and financial impacts of the intervention that the government is making through its 4 budgets, which total a huge amount of money, exceeding well over 100 billion when you take into account the operating budget as well as the stimulus packages. So what we ideally want to see is that the data should be showing a catalytic effect of the stimulus. When I say catalytic, it means that it's having a revitalizing effect on companies and on sectors. This is particularly challenging in the Singapore case, to be actually fair to the government, because 75% of our GDP is export orientated. So really the best stimulus is the stimulus that comes from growth from markets of final demand that we service. And really, in truth, no amount of stimulus internally from the government can substitute from that, even in the short term. What it can do is to try to keep workforces intact and businesses intact and promote innovation and ideas in such a way that when those markets of final demand start to trend towards recovery, we are in a position to take advantage of that, to hang on to the coattails and to be competitive. Because remember, we don't operate in a vacuum. Our global economy is now interconnected and interdependent, and we are competing on a global level. And so it's important that we make use of the time we have, not only for the purpose of wage support or business cash flow support, but really to try to make sure that those are triangulated with support for innovation and ideas so that we can be more competitive. And so as those markets of final demand start to trend towards recovery, we want to see whether we are trending towards growth and therefore taking advantage of their recovery. If there is a delinkage or an asymmetry between they trending towards recovery and we not trending towards recovery, the stimulus has had probably perverse side effects and unintended consequences. And that will be a huge problem to reverse. But if we can see some synchronization, even if there's a degree of lagginess, then it's done what it's supposed to do, and we then can have more optimism about organic recovery, progressively substituting for stimulus effects. What we want to try to do with the stimulus is also target the right sectors and for the right reasons. By right sectors, I mean sectors that are value adding to the economy, that have a good representation or high representation of Singapore residents in the workforce, and which have a future that we can project as having a growing demand. What we should also be able to politically accept is the sunsetting of certain sectors which have the converse characteristics, where they are not economically value adding, where there's a very high representation of foreign workers and low representation of Singaporean resident workers, and which don't have a projection for growing demand over the longer term. This is, and I mentioned politically acceptable. It is a political decision to be able to stomach this, because there will be blowback, because some of these businesses will be owned by Singaporeans, and there will be a proportion of the workforce which will be Singapore residents. So it's up to the government to decide whether it can stomach the hard choice of allowing some sectors to grow and supporting them, and some sectors to shrivel, shrink, and ultimately sunset. We also want to measure data to determine whether creative destruction is taking place or being discouraged. And in the previous video, I mentioned that creative destruction is a concept of allowing competitive action to be able to free up scarce factor inputs in terms of human talent, in terms of capital, in terms of land, in terms of energy, in terms of clients, in terms of networks, to transition from businesses that have been poorly run, they're poorly financed, they are failing, towards businesses which are more successful, with they've done the right things in the past before the crisis by making investments, being better organized, being better managed, being better led, having better business plans, etc. If this doesn't happen because the stimulus is supporting both poorly run companies as well as well-run companies, then you can have perverse outcomes. These perverse outcomes are where well-run companies become discouraged because they are unable to tap on the scarce factor inputs that are trapped in poorly run companies in order to feed further growth of their companies. And they also become discouraged because they feel that why bother trying so hard when the easier path can be just simply to muddle along and tap grants and subsidies from the government in the same way that a poorly run company does. And it leaves a legacy effect because post the crisis, these poorly run companies will continue to linger on as a kind of like zombie companies. And this can create also conditions in which, as an economy, we don't optimize around competitiveness. Now, the data from the Ministry of Manpower projects, and I say projects because it's a provisional indicator, that's why there's a P, that unemployment rate for residents is at 3.3%. As of March 2020. Unemployment is growing. There's an increase of almost 20,000. Job vacancies per 100 job seekers is declining. It's now 84 versus 100 job seekers, and that I think trend will continue. Total labor force participation rate is at 68%, which is still healthy, but I think that will, of course, naturally have a correlation with declining economic performance at the aggregate level, and so we'll see that reducing. And yes, you can see number of retrenchments is growing. It's 3,000 as of first Q 2020. I think you'll see this number being higher in the second Q 2020. I think you'll see a revision of the 1Q numbers, but what's more worrying is what's going to happen in the second half of 2020 and the first half of 2021, where I think when we look back at these numbers of 3,000 or 4,000, we're going to actually think of that as good days, because I expect these numbers to very easily double or triple. In terms of hours worked, I think this is an indicator that we have to pay attention to, because while we talk a lot about unemployment, we don't talk a lot about underemployment. And I think one of the effects of the economic contraction is going to be that workers are going to be underemployed. So they go from full-time to part-time, they go from permanent employment to contract employment. And new hires may start off from contract employments, which are structured around a limited number of hours. And of course, this is going to have impacts on income. It's going to have impacts in terms of job security. It's also going to have impacts in terms of benefits that typically follow full employment. These are health benefits. These are also development and training benefits. Typically, if you're on a contract basis, you don't have access to these, and firms are not obligated to provide them to you. And this will have longer term consequences in terms of the quality and the competitiveness of our workforce. And in the time being, it will also have, in terms of a combination of rising unemployment, rising underemployment, and contract term employment, in totality will have a reductionist effect on consumption, which will have an impact in the domestic economy because the consumption multiplier will reduce. And that means retail and F&B and fashion, I think are all going to see and are already seeing a very difficult time, which will continue and actually worsen through 2020 into 2021. So business owners who run these kinds of businesses, they have to make very tough decisions as to whether they should give up now or if they want to stay for the long haul over the next 18 months. But that decision to stay with the long haul is going to be a costly one, and they're going to have to think hard about whether they were prepared to bear that cost, or whether their investors are going to be prepared to bear that cost, or whether they can get new investors to help see them through from a cash reserve as well as from a cash reserve point of view, in order to be able to substitute for cash flow reductions. And so these are non-trivial issues for workers, for households, but also for businesses, especially businesses in the consumption side of the industry. So that brings me to the end of part 4. Tomorrow I'll be talking to you about part 5, which is going to be focused on a very sensitive topic on population management. And that video is going to be longer than this one. It's going to raise some uncomfortable questions. So I hope you're prepared for it. It'll be released on the same channel and the same time. And I look forward to speaking with you then. In the meantime, stay well and stay healthy. And I hope you found the videos to date, part 1 to part 4, useful, as well as practical in helping you to make sense of the complexity, not only facing us today, but the challenges that are before us over the next 12 to 24 months. Thank you, and good day.